Today's episode is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.anxietydiariespodcast.com/audible. Hello and welcome to Anxiety Diaries, a weekly podcast about mental health, incredible people, and so much more. I'm your host, Scott Newmeyer, and this is episode 18. If you like what you hear, please make sure you subscribe. And if you get a chance, head over to Apple Podcasts, rate and review the show. It really does help and we really appreciate it. Today on the podcast, I wanted to take a few quick minutes to talk about 5 things that I do to make a bad day better. You know those days when it feels like nothing is going right, you're just having a rough day? That's okay. Everybody has those rough days. But these are 5 things that I do to try to turn those days around, make them at least manageable. With Independence Day coming up here in the United States, I know that there are a lot of folks that have a hard time around holidays, including me, and I just wanted to tell you to do your best. You'll be okay, and whatever you can do is enough. It really is. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. So I'm going to go over these 5 things pretty briefly. These are not things that I do in the case of a panic attack. I did an episode about that already. Check back on episode 10 if you're looking for that. These are just 5 things that I do that either cheer me up or put me in a better mind space and just help make those days a little bit more bearable. And then I'm going to also answer some listener questions. I've got a few voicemails that people have sent in, and then next week we'll be back with a new guest. And that's what we're going to talk about today. What do you do when you have a bad day? You know those days when it just feels like everything's hard, everything's difficult, it's hard to get through the day, you just want it to be over? I have those days too, and a lot of people do. And there's no way to erase those bad days. Having bad days is okay, it happens sometimes. There are some things that I do that just put me in a better mind space. There are just a few things that I do that make me feel a little bit better. They make the day manageable. And as I always say, the best thing about a bad day is the fact that tomorrow's a new one. So you can start over the next day and that's no problem. But if you're looking to try to turn that bad day around, maybe some of these things will work for you as well. So without further ado, here are the 5 things that I do to try to make the day better when I'm having a bad day. The first one is probably pretty obvious. I spend time with my family, my wife and my kids. I'm lucky enough to have an incredible family and people around me. Not everyone is so lucky, but when I'm having a bad day, one of the first things I do is turn to either my wife or my 2 children, and I just go and give them a hug, cuddle them for a few minutes, talk to them about their day, share some things that you're grateful for, some things that you haven't heard from them before, talk to them about it, maybe play a game with them, and just sit on the couch and cuddle them. Even if they're watching cartoons or something, go sit and watch cartoons with them for a few minutes. There's nothing that cheers me up faster than seeing my kids laugh and have fun. So for me, the first thing is spend time with my family. The second thing I do to try to turn those bad days around is move my body. Now, I'm terrible at exercise. I used to be great at exercise, but I've gotten out of shape and I'm not so good at exercising anymore. I'm not good about keeping myself disciplined to exercise. So one of the things that I do instead to kind of get my exercise and get my body moving, and this sounds really weird because it doesn't sound like something you'd want to do or something that would cheer you up, but it's actually cleaning. When I'm feeling like I'm in a rough place or I'm just kind of stuck, one of the things I do is I put on a headband, I put on some earphones, put some music on in my head, and then I just start cleaning the house. This has a 2-edged effect for me because 1, it makes my wife happy because I'm doing some cleaning up around the house that, normally she would ask me to do or normally she might do herself, and now it's already done. So she's happy about that, which makes me happy, and there's nothing wrong with that. So the second effect, though, is that it gets me moving. It gives me something to focus on. I focus on it, I get my head in the game, and I just put my head down, start doing dishes or laundry or cleaning up after the kids, things like that. It really is one of those mindless kind of acts that just gets you out of your current headspace. Builds up a little bit of a sweat, at least for me, because I'm out of shape, and that puts me in a better mood, and I usually feel a little bit better afterwards. So the second thing is moving my body. The third thing I do when I'm having a rough day and I need to kind of just try to turn that day around a little bit is also a little strange, but for me, it works. And that's actually getting down to work. Work for me is it's very therapeutic in the fact that I know what I have to accomplish, and I just sit down and I get so laser focused that I look at what I have to do and I just focus in and I get it done. And I don't think about my own anxieties. I don't sit inside my own head for a long time. I just get the work done. And this is probably more of a distraction than anything else. And I would never really advocate that you should use distractions to get away from your anxiety. That doesn't really work in the long term. But sometimes you just feel like you really need to turn the day around, to feel better and not worry about the long term. And that's one of the things that works for me. It really honestly distracts me from anything else that's going on in the world at that moment. And I can just kind of hunker down, focus, and get that work done. The fourth thing for me is entertainment. I've been a huge movie, TV fan, pop culture junkie for my entire life, pretty much. So if I'm having a rough day, sitting down, putting a movie on, putting a TV show on that I like, playing some video games, I gotta be honest with you, we got the Nintendo Switch this past year, and that has been a godsend for me. You know, we have a 2-year-old, a little kid toddling around the house, and sometimes it's hard to get that time in front of, you know, a video game if you're playing a big console. But the cool thing about the Nintendo Switch is you can put it in your hands, sit at the couch with your kid, let them watch their cartoons or play with them even. Sometimes my 2-year-old will sit in my lap and watch me play on my little handheld Switch. So video games is a good thing to get yourself immersed in when you're feeling a little anxious and you just want to kind of get yourself out of that. And then finally, music. Music is huge for me. Usually when I'm feeling anxious, there are two different directions I'll go with my music. One is I'll go with a little bit of a harder music, something like punk or something that's a little bit more fast-paced. Some of the bands that I always go to are people like Aaron West and the Roaring Twenties, Senses Fail. I mean, the lead singer literally wrote an entire album about having to take time off from the band to deal with his anxiety disorder. So all the songs are pretty much about, you know, what he dealt with in that year of anxiety. It brings me back to a time when I used to listen to that when I was a little bit younger, and it's just really good driving music to get outside my own head and really just get myself kind of pumped up. Alkaline Trio is one of my favorite bands of all time, and that music really gets me pumped as well. If no one's home, I'll pop the headphones in or I'll put it on the big, huge Bluetooth speaker and I'll just rock out. And that makes me feel a whole lot better. The other direction I'll go is something a little bit more exciting that makes you want to get your body moving, kind of poppy, something like Jon Bellion. Huge fan of his and his music. It just makes you want to move. So the fourth thing is pop culture. Entertainment for me really helps me get in a better mood. And then the fifth thing for me that I do to try to make a bad day better or turn around a bad day is work on this podcast. Now, this won't apply to everybody, obviously, if you're not doing a podcast. But for me, this podcast is so meaningful because I get so many questions, so many comments, and so many messages from you guys saying that it's helpful or that it helped you deal with your anxiety or you shared it with a friend or you listened to your first episode and you loved it. All these messages mean so much to me. You guys don't even understand how exciting that is for me when I get those messages and voicemails and emails and things like that. So working on this podcast it really puts me in a good mood, really puts me in a good headspace. And I appreciate that. Obviously, that doesn't apply to you if you don't have a podcast, but it does in the fact that the reason that I love doing this podcast is because it's something that I'm passionate about, something that I really love to do, and it's something that makes me feel good about myself having accomplished it. So if you have that thing that you love to do, that one thing that is your passion project that you're passionate about, sit down and work on that passion project. Make it happen. That can easily turn your day around in an instant. So for me, the 5 things that I do to make a bad day better, to turn that bad day around and make it a good day, or at least to make it manageable, are 1, spend time with family and friends, wife, kids. 2, move my body, exercise, or in my case, clean the house. 3, work. 4, entertainment, pop culture, movies, TV, music, games. And 5 is work on your passion project. For me, it's this podcast. Those 5 things always help me to kind of get over the bump in a day and make me feel better about the day. And the reason I wanted to get through that list fairly quickly was because I've gotten a lot of messages from listeners of the podcast, either voicemails or voice messages emailed to me, emails, direct messages on Instagram, all these things. I've gotten so many awesome comments and questions that I wanted to take a few minutes in this episode today to answer some of those questions. So that's what we're going to do next. And the first question I'm going to answer came to me through the Anchor app. The question comes from Q the Nurse, And the episode that he's referencing in this question is episode 13 with our incredible guest, Sarah Wilson. So without further ado, here is Q the Nurse's question.
Hey, Q the Nurse here, and thank you so much for this episode of the podcast, because it's real and it's super important, and everyone has a little bit of this. But what I got a lot from your guest is that she is super, super open about her anxiety. She is so out there. People know of it. She writes about it. That's her job. That's her lifestyle. And she lives it, right? But could you speak a little bit to, and I know all the advice she gave, it is super helpful, but one of the hardest hurdles for, I would say myself personally, and a lot of people I know that have anxiety, is speaking about it without feeling embarrassed, without feeling bad about yourself, without feeling shameful about it, right? So could you speak to the issue of who do you talk to? Who do you go out to talk to? Where do you vent? And how can you do that without feeling the shame, the doubt, the judgment? Please and thank you.
So thank you for sending over that question, Q the Nurse. I really appreciate that. I appreciate the kind words about the podcast. As for your question, that's a really good one, and one that a lot of people have asked about, and I know one that people struggle with quite a bit. I've talked about this a little bit on the podcast before, but one of the ways that I go about that is to first talk to the people that are closest to you, that understand and that know what you're going through and that you feel comfortable with. Once you get that story out there and you start talking about it with them, and you know that they're there for you, they care for you, and they understand. Once you start to talk to them about it, it opens up a little bit inside you, right? You're able to kind of more freely talk about it. And honestly, when I talk about it, my anxiety goes down. Doing this podcast is actually therapeutic for me because I feel less anxious as I'm talking about my anxiety. It's a strange thing, but that's how it works sometimes. So when you're talking about your anxiety to someone that you may not know, or somebody that's in a position of authority as well, it can be hard, like if your boss doesn't understand. So I talked about this in a previous episode, but I had a boss at one point. He was the head of the company, the CEO, very nice guy, fun, engaging. I really liked him, but I also had an anxiety disorder. So he would ask us to go out to lunch quite often, or he would ask individuals to go out to lunch quite often, talk about business, talk about whatever we want to talk about, have lunch. It's good for you. It's good for him. It's good for the company. Anyway, he would ask me all the time to go out to lunch, and I would always say no, and I would say no. And I started getting to the point where I felt uncomfortable that he was asking in earnest. He wanted to go out and treat me to a nice lunch, and we would have a chat about work. It's one of those nice perks, right, of knowing the boss, being friendly with the boss. But my boss didn't understand, and he didn't know at the time that I had an anxiety disorder, that I had panic and anxiety attacks. He did not know. So after telling him no a bunch of times, I finally decided at one point that I was going to go and talk to him. So I made an appointment with him, just a regular meeting, and we sat down in his office. I just told him, I said, I have something I need to talk to you about. So he said, all right. We set up a time. I went in there and I sat down, and I just told him straight out. I said, listen, I want you to know that I really appreciate that you asked me out to lunch, that you asked me to do things, that you're taking an interest in my career, and that you know that I have something to bring to the company. I appreciate that. I see you, and I thank you for that. But I also want to let you know that there's this thing about me. I have this anxiety disorder, which makes it very difficult for me to feel comfortable when I go out with other people, especially if I'm not driving. And that's the reason that I've been saying no when you ask me out to lunch. So I wanted to tell you because I didn't want you to feel like I was shunning you, or that I was just saying no because I didn't like you, or I was saying I didn't want to go because I just didn't feel like it. It's more than that. It's bigger than that for me. So I wanted to come here and I wanted to just tell you and let you know. So I got all that out. My heart's beating 100 miles a minute, beating through my chest. I feel super anxious about it, but I'm glad that I said it, that I got it out there. It's kind of like ripping off the Band-Aid, right? So we got through that, and he didn't say anything for the first minute or so, just kind of was taking it in. And I didn't really read that as bad or anything like that. But then he looked at me and he said, thank you. He said, thanks for letting me know. I really appreciate that. Thanks for bringing this to me. Thanks for telling me your personal story. And I understand. Now, I'm not saying that every single boss out there is going to be like that. Every single boss is going to understand and be sympathetic. I'm sure there are some that won't. But I think the majority of people out there are starting to understand what mental health is, what anxiety disorders, depression. I think most people are starting to understand those types of things. And I would venture to say that a lot of bosses out there will be just as accommodating and kind and helpful and understanding as mine was. And I really appreciate that, boss. It's a story that I tell a lot because I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful that I didn't have to feel ostracized or I didn't have to feel like I couldn't get ahead because of it. And the best part about that was that every job since then, not only do I tell my upper management or the bosses or the hiring person, not only do I tell these people, but I actually tell them when I'm getting hired. Has that led to a case where maybe I wasn't hired for something I probably could have been hired for? Maybe once or twice, sure. But I'd rather be honest with them up front than lie about it and then find out later and then it's a problem. So every single boss that I've had since that boss, I've just told up front, this is how I am. This is what I deal with. I'm working on it. I'm continuing to work on it. I will continue to work on it, but this is how I am right now. And I just want you to know that, if you ask me out to lunch, maybe I'll say no, but it has nothing to do with you. It's all about me. And I can tell you that every job I've had since then, not counting the ones that maybe I didn't get for this reason or whatever, every job I've had since then, every boss I've had since then has been absolutely incredible. My current bosses, the bosses that I was with for 8 years, they have been absolutely phenomenal. In fact, I'm planning to have them on the podcast at some point to talk about what it's like when your remote worker, deals with something like this, because they've been so good and so kind and understanding. And they understand that just because I have an anxiety disorder does not make me worse at my job. In fact, it may make me better at my job. One of the things that comes along with anxiety disorders is hypervigilance. Royce White talks about this quite a bit. Hypervigilance is when you're really just able to super focus on things, really, really focus. And that's one of the things for me, my anxiety does. I'm so focused in on work that I'm very quick with my work. I'm very thorough with my work. And I really think that my anxiety disorder makes me a better worker. But regardless, even if it didn't, I think that my bosses would understand. I think your bosses will understand. So my advice to you is to go out there, start telling your story, start telling people that you feel this certain way and this is what it does to you physically and this is how it makes you feel. And I think most people will understand. I think most people will be there for you. Sure, there will be people that aren't here and there, but maybe those aren't your people. So keep spreading your message, keep talking, keep being open and honest. And I'm telling you, the more you talk about it, the better you will feel. At least for me, that's the case. And I think it is for a lot of people. So I hope that answered your question. Cue the nurse. I appreciate you sending it in. So this next voice message isn't actually a question, but a story. Kendra from Canada sent over a voice message telling me about her first anxiety attack. And it's so powerful and such an emotional message that she wanted to share. And she was happy to share it and told me I could use it on the podcast. And I just wanted you guys to hear it because it's really powerful and it's really something that I hope more people can hear. So this is Kendra from Canada telling us about her first panic attack.
Hi, I came across your podcast and it really touched me and I want to tell my story. I think the first time I ever had my first anxiety attack was when I was going out to lunch with my then boyfriend, now ex-boyfriend, and my family. And we were discussing dinners and where to go for dinner. And they kept asking me questions about where to go for dinner. And I could feel my face start to get super hot. And I felt like I was having almost an out of body experience. And I actually just ran out the door. I ran out the restaurant door and I ran to the car and I just sat there and just couldn't breathe. And then I guess I kind of just like talked myself out of it and pretended that never happened and then walked back into the restaurant and we just continued our day. And I have been struggling with this now for 5 years. And I just lost my job because of it, because I couldn't keep my anxiety under control. And I would love to tell my story. I hope I'm not alone. I would love to tell my story to your listeners. Maybe it would help me. Maybe it would help them. Please let me know. Feel free to email me anytime. My name is Kendra. I live in Canada. Thank you.
Hi, Scott. Thank you so much for reaching out.
and for offering to let me tell my story. I honestly don't know where I am today and how I got to this state. I've been suffering from anxiety for so long. And I told you my first story, and really it's turning into a pattern for me, but because I've been hiding it, whereby I have these attacks, I hide them, and then I have to make up excuses as to why I'm not acting rationally, why I'll tell a lie or hide something. And I think it all has to do with these anxiety attacks. I'm so scared of being imperfect or letting someone down or failing at something that I try so hard to hide it. And then it just manifests itself in me until I have these attacks. And it's starting to really affect my now adult life. And I keep having to start from scratch. And I don't know how many times I'm going to be able to start from scratch before I really have to admit to myself that there's something wrong and that I have to deal with it. So this is my first step in dealing with it, is being honest with myself and talking about it out loud, not just thinking about it. Working past this, being really aware of when I start to feel that I have to lie in order to be perfect, which perpetuates these attacks. I do hope we can continue this conversation. I do hope that I can tell my story to people, and I do hope that I get better. Thanks again, Scott.
Thank you so much, Kendra, for sending in your story. Thank you for sharing your story. And thank you for being you. I know your story will resonate with people and it will help someone else out there. And I just want you to know that it will get better. I promise it will. I'm proud of you for sharing your story, and we're definitely going to have you on the podcast in an upcoming episode. Thanks again, Kendra. So those are all the listener messages that we have time for today, but please do send in your voice messages. I'm happy to answer questions as much as I can, and I'm happy to share more of these great voice messages on future episodes. So I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please check back next week. We've got a great guest coming up. This next episode is going to be a great one as well. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week. Call us, leave us a message at 732-903-4441, or drop us an email at anxietydiariespodcast@gmail.com. You can find the podcast at www.anxietydiariespodcast.com, where you can sign up for our newsletter as well. And you can find us on Instagram and Facebook at Anxiety Diaries Podcast. We're also on Twitter at Anxiety Diary Pod. Thanks again for listening. Be well, and we'll see you next week.